Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nakia Thomas, and I will be presenting on the article of Christine Jurgensen in The Story of How Sex Changed by Joanne Meyerowitz. Okay, let's jump right into it. So the learning objectives or the takeaways we should have from this article after reviewing the article is reviewing concepts and terminology that clarify sex, sexuality, gender, and identity, the publicity and importance surrounding Christine Jurgensen's story, and the impact of the media and press sensation and how that shifted Americans' understanding of sex in the mid-20th century, 1950s. So a little bit about our author, Joanne Meyerowitz. Meyerowitz received her bachelor's from the University of Chicago and her master's and PhD from Stanford University. She taught for several years at Indiana University and the University of Cincinnati. She was an editor of the American History Journal for 5 years. Currently, she is a professor of history and American studies at Yale. She's also a director of the Yale's Research Initiative on the History of Sexuality. And her area of expertise is 20th century history, gender and sexuality, global poverty. And she has written 4 books currently, which they all focus around gender and sexuality. The insert in our book is actually from her larger body of work, which is How Sex Changed, A History of Transsexuality in the United States. So some of the main questions addressed in this article, and mind you, it was a longer article, but some of the main questions that were addressed was, why was America slow in adopting the understanding and terminology of sex? Why was Christine Jurgensen's story so important to America's adaptation to transsexualism? How did the media and press narrative of sex, gender, and sexuality affect the medical community in the early 20th century? How does transsexuality raise questions about what it means to be a woman? And finally, what characteristics makes one a man or woman? So now we're going to jump into some of the terminology and vocabulary that was introduced during the early 20th century, the 1950s to be exact. So on page 617 of our book, the author Meyerowitz, she spent a lot of time clearly defining vocabulary that was adopted during the 1950s. Some of the bigger ones are here, which is sex roles. Sex roles are the cultural behavior expected of men and women, coined by Margaret Mead. Sexual behavior is an outline of a range of erotic practices. That term was adopted by Alfred Kinsey. Biological determinism is a theory that tries to explain a person's behavior and or other aspects of their life in relation to his or her genetic makeup. For example, men are stronger and women are emotional because of their genetic makeup, which those are obviously false. Biological sex is chromosomes, genes, genitals, and hormones, and some of those characteristics can be modified or changed. Gender is masculine or feminine behaviors or characteristics, and transsexual. The term was coined by Sexology's Question and Answer Department Editor, Dr. David Caldwell, in 1950. The term was introduced in response to a female-to-male correspondent who inquired about sex change surgery. He referred to that person as psychopathia transsexualis. He later clarified and redefined the word transsexuals in 1950 in a question and answers on sex life and sexual problems of transsexuals. He defined transsexuals as individuals who are physically of one sex and apparently psychologically of the opposite sex. Transsexuals include heterosexuals, homosexuals, bisexuals, and others. A large element of transvestites have transsexual leanings. And now that we have a clear understanding of the terminology, vocabulary, and climate of the late 1940s, early 1950s, I think it's a good time to transition over to the story of Christine Jurgensen. Christine Jurgensen underwent sex reassignment surgery in 1952 in Denmark. She gained popularity after her return to New York in 1953 in a front-page story reported by the New York Daily News headline, "Ex-GI Becomes Blonde Beauty." What's most important about Christine Jurgensen's story is prior to her media attention, many American doctors in the medical community only acknowledged sex reassignment surgery or corrections for individuals diagnosed with intersex conditions. Unlike individuals diagnosed with an intersex condition, Christine Jurgensen was physically a normal male wanting to transition as a woman. Christine quoted herself as having a biological disorder or a hormonal imbalance where she knew that she was a woman but was physically a male. She became the face and a role model for many male to female and female to male individuals around the world who had longed for representation and clarity in their own life. Her bravery to share her story created an open dialogue about sex and gender boundaries and that American doctors and scientists were apprehensive to redefine before. The U.S. adopted the idea of transsexuals first through popular culture with the help of Christine Jurgensen, then acknowledgement by the science and medical community, and eventually through the courts. While Europe and European medical communities used understanding and education as the driving force behind transsexuals and sex change surgeries. Now that we have a clear understanding of Christine Jurgensen's contribution to the 1950s, we can move on to the student activity. The student activity consists of just 3 short questions. This first question, you're going to use your prior knowledge of history in the 1950s to answer. Number 1, discuss and name a popular culture icon or icons of the 1950s that helped push the boundaries of sexual freedom and identity. Number 2, what was American doctors' approach to sex reassignment surgery prior to media sensation of Jurgensen? And number 3, did the media and press attention of Christine Jurgensen's story influence the medical community in the U.S. and why? And that concludes my presentation of Christine Jurgensen and the story of how sex changed. Thank you all.